Dear ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, partners, UCA community, you are all welcome to the distinguished lecture series with Mr. Vint Cerf on the history and future of the Internet. Today we have a very special guest, and we're grateful for this rare opportunity to listen with you all to his visionary presentation and interact with him at this live online lecture. Before I hand over to Mr. Shaukat Ali Khan, Chief Information Officer at the University of Central Asia, just a couple of housekeeping moments for all of you who have joined. Firstly, for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, this webinar is available in Russian as well as in English. In order to select the language that you wish to listen, please select the globe icon located in the bottom right-hand corner of the toolbar of the meeting window. You can choose the language, and if you prefer, mute the original audio. You can also ask questions on Facebook page of UCA. Secondly, if any of you would like to raise questions during the webinar, please do so using Zoom's Q&A session, which is also located, Q&A button, which is also located in the toolbar below. You can type your question in, and at the appropriate point of time, this will be addressed by the panelists. We would like to thank you all for your interest, and with my great pleasure now, I would like to hand over to Mr. Shaukat Ali Khan, Chief Information Officer at the University of Central Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elnora. Good afternoon and welcome to this latest in our distinguished lecture series. This lecture is a partnership between us at the University of Central Asia with the World Bank and the State Committee for Information Technology and Communications of Kyrgyz Republic. Thank you all those involved in making this happen. We are really pleased to have such a strong relationships that can benefit all of us and people of Central Asia. Without any further delay, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Vint Cerf today. Widely known as one of the fathers of the Internet, Vint is the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the Internet, which is particularly exciting for me personally, having studied IT network management many years ago. Vint will speak to us on the topic of the Internet past, present, and future. He is currently the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, where he contributes to global policy development and continued spread of the Internet. Cerf is a recipient of numerous awards and commendations in connection with his work on the Internet, including the US Presidential Medal of Freedom, US National Medal of Technology, the Queen Elizabeth Prize of Engineering, the Prince of Asturias Award, the Japan Prize, the Charles Stark Draper Award, the ACM Turing Award, and the Legion d'Honneur and 29 honorary degrees. Please welcome Mr. Vint Cerf.
Здравствуйте, как дела? And that's all the Russian you're going to get out of me today. I'm going to ask Shaukat if he could show the slides for me, and we'll step our way through this presentation. So Shaukat, can you bring up the first slide, please? And let's now go to the second slide, which takes us back to 1969. If you can perhaps go to full screen, that would also help people see the slides. So while you're doing that, I was a graduate student at UCLA in the late 1960s, and it was about that time that the American Defense Department began exploring the possibility of building a network using what is called packet switching technology, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. This network was intended to connect about a dozen universities around the United States. You see a 4-node network in this picture. That was the initial configuration. The intent was to expand the network to include a number of others. And the purpose behind this was to share the research activities of those universities who were at that time working on artificial intelligence and general computer science. And so even back then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, artificial intelligence was a very important notion that the Defense Department wanted to explore. This network, called ARPANET, was an extremely successful implementation of packet switching. And its success led to the next big step in the development of the internet. And so if we go to the next slide, what you'll see, I'm leaping forward now through several years of development. So let me walk you through that. Starting in 1973, my colleague, Robert Kahn, who had worked on the ARPANET, moved to the Advanced Research Projects Agency at the same time in late 1972 when I moved to Stanford University. And in 1973, he came to my laboratory at Stanford and said that we have a problem. And I said, what do you mean we have a problem? He pointed out that the success of the packet switching technology on the ARPANET led the American Defense Department to consider the use of computers in what is called command and control. The question was, can we put computers in mobile vehicles, in ships at sea, and in aircraft, and use their computing power to improve our ability to manage resources in a defense environment? And so that led to the problem that we couldn't use dedicated wires to connect all the various networks together, because you can't use wires to connect mobile vehicles or aircraft or ships at sea. And so my colleague, Bob Kahn, began working at ARPA on a mobile packet radio system and also a packet satellite system for wide area packet communication, in addition to the already existing ARPANET. And so the problem which he posed at Stanford in 1973 was, how could we connect these different kinds of packet switch networks together in such a way that it would look very uniform to any computer that's on any of the interconnected networks? And after about a 6-month period, we reached the conclusion that a particular protocol design could achieve this objective. We called it the Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP. And incorporated in that protocol was a global addressing scheme that allowed any computer on any of the networks to refer to any other computer on any other networks. And that was, of course, a very important part of the architectural design. It had to work everywhere. We didn't constrain the number of networks that could be interconnected. And we certainly didn't constrain the kinds of computers that could be interconnected, because the original ARPANET project had quite a wide range of different brands of computers that normally would not interoperate with each other, but which were made to do so by the protocols that were used in the ARPANET, and which were mirrored in some ways, although somewhat differently implemented in the TCP protocols. In the course of doing the work on TCP, of course, when we implemented the first version, we discovered we'd made mistakes. We iterated through 4 different versions of the TCP protocol, and about the 3rd version, we concluded that we needed to split that protocol into 2 pieces. One piece is called the Internet Protocol, and the upper layer is renamed the Transmission Control Protocol. The reason we had to make that split was so that we could do real-time communication in such a way that we did not necessarily have to guarantee 100% delivery of the traffic through the network. The TCP protocol was determined to transmit data reliably, and so if it couldn't verify that a packet had arrived, it would retransmit, which means that the receiving side had to filter out duplicates, for example, and the sending side had to detect that a packet had been lost and retransmit it. So it was a reliable part of the system. The Internet Protocol, on the other hand, was designed to be rapid and quick, but it didn't guarantee delivery at all. The reason that we ended up making that split was to handle real-time kinds of communication like voice, video, and radar and other kinds of things. And it's, I think, significant that we were thinking about voice and video as well as data way back in the early 1970s as part and parcel of a command and control system. Around 1976, I left Stanford University and joined the Advanced Research Projects Agency and my colleague, Robert Kahn. And a year later, this particular diagram shows you a test which I requested of the developers of the internet in order to demonstrate that the technology would actually work in a multi-network environment with very, very different kinds of networks. The mobile radio network and the packet satellite network and the original ARPANET, these all had different data rates, they had different error rates, they had different packet sizes, they had different addressing schemes, they had different latencies. And so they were, although they were all packet switched, they were all very different in their internal operation. And of course, the TCP/IP protocols were intended to make everything look uniform so that any computer on any of the networks saw this as a uniform system. So this demonstration in November of 1977 was very important to me as the program manager, because I wanted to show that this stuff actually worked. And so that was a very important milestone. We worked very, very hard for the next several years implementing the TCP/IP protocols on as many different operating systems as we could. And then on January 1st, 1983, we moved the entire ARPANET packet satellite network and packet radio net over to operate purely on top of TCP/IP. So it was a big flag day. If we could go to the next slide, please. What you see in this next slide is a rendering of the National Science Foundation network, which was set up by our research agency, the National Science Foundation, in order to connect some 3,000 universities in the US that were carrying out research of any kind, whether it was physics and biology and chemistry and astronomy and computer science. So NSF decided to adopt the TCP/IP protocols. Concurrent with that, the Department of Energy built its own internet backbone and connected it to the rest of them. They called it ESNet, for Energy Sciences Network. So did NASA. They developed the NASA Science Internet, or NSINet, and they connected as well. So we had an increasing number of networks that were part of the internet design and implementation. The NSFNet gets its start around 1986 or so, and the others about at the same time. So in the US, we were seeing the research agencies investing in internet in order to support further research among those various agencies. And in that same general time frame, the mid to late 1980s, we were also starting to see similar implementations of the TCP/IP protocols by academic institutions in other parts of the world, in Europe in particular. So we're starting to see during that mid to late 1980s period a serious interest in the academic community and the research community in these technologies. Companies were formed, for example, Cisco Systems, to build routers that could use and manage the TCP/IP protocols. So there was a business in creating equipment and in software that would run at the edges of the machine or the edges of the network. So this is starting to commercialize. By 1989, I had received permission from what was then called the Federal Networking Council in the US, which had responsibility for policy for the internet, to connect a commercial system to the then internet backbone in the US. That was a big deal because the internet backbone run by the US government did not, up until then, allow commercial traffic to go on the government-sponsored backbones. And so when I got permission to connect a commercial system to the government internet, that was important because I was able to show the private sector that there was a business offering internet service, but the private sector didn't have to build a national backbone in order to demonstrate that. So starting in 1989, 3 commercial internet services were initiated in the United States. One was called UUNet, one was called PSINet, and one was called SurfNet out in California. So 1989 is the beginning of the commercialization of the internet in the United States. As all of you might be aware, there were contending protocols. One of them was called the Open Systems Interconnection model, which had a different suite of layered protocols in competition with the TCP/IP protocol suite. And that battle went back and forth from about 1978 until 1993. But by 1993, the internet had spread fairly dramatically around the world. And on top of that, many of you will know that Tim Berners-Lee, I should say, Sir Tim Berners-Lee now, developed the World Wide Web and released those HTTP protocols and the HTML formats in 1991. By 1993, commercialization of the World Wide Web began in the form of a company called Netscape Communications, which was run by Jim Clark, who was the founder of Silicon Graphics. He brought several people from the National Center for Supercomputer Applications in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, who had developed a version of Tim Berners-Lee's browser called Mosaic, which was a graphical user interface. So Mark Andreessen, Eric Bina, and others were moved to the West Coast to start Netscape Communications. Their product was extremely popular, as was the original Mosaic from NCSA. Lots and lots of people downloaded and implemented the Netscape Communications Netscape Navigator software. And in 1995, the company went public, which means that their shares in the company were made available on a public stock exchange, and the stock value went through the roof. That initiated what we called in the past the dot boom period, when everyone in the venture capital world was investing heavily in the internet. If we could go to the next slide. We'll just wait for, here we go. So this is what the internet looks like now. It's a very colorful and very large system. And the colors here are intended to represent different operators of networks in the internet. There are hundreds of thousands of them. The point that I want to make with this slide is that these networks are all run independently of each other. Each of the operators chooses the software and chooses the hardware they will use to implement their piece of the internet. They decide on what terms and conditions to interconnect with other network service providers. They have different business models. Some of them are for-profit, some of them are not for-profit, some of them are run by governments. The point that I want to make here is that there is enormous flexibility in the architecture of the internet and the business models that support it. That allowed for a substantial amount of freedom for people to build pieces of internet and find someone to connect to. And that is exactly what has led to the organic expansion of the internet over the decades since it was turned on in 1983. If we could go to the next slide now. So this is the kind of thing that you see today. We'll call it the Internet of Things. These are simply devices that have internet capability. They have the TCP/IP protocols on board. They may have application software on board, and they have radios or Ethernet connections in order to interconnect to the internet. And some of these devices, frankly, were kind of unexpected, like an internet-enabled refrigerator. I mean, what do you do with an internet-enabled refrigerator? And I remember speculating quite a long time ago when this idea came along that maybe the refrigerator could have little RFID chips on the things that are inside the refrigerator, so it could know what it has inside. And then while you're at work, it's surfing the internet looking for recipes that it could tell you about when you come home, to say you could make these recipes with what I have inside. And of course, you could imagine even more elaborate scenarios. For example, if the refrigerator knows that you're on a diet, it might refuse to open at certain times of the day, which would be a terrible future. So we should worry about things like that. Some of the other things, I'm sure many of you may already have, picture frames, for example, that are internet capable. They can download images and cycle through them and show your favorite photographs. So for grandparents like my wife and me, this is a big deal because our grandsons or their parents, our sons and daughters, can upload photographs of the grandchildren. And when we get up in the morning and have our cup of coffee, we can cycle through what's been happening to the family in the course of the week. The one in the middle, the picture in the middle, is really quite astonishing. This is an internet-enabled surfboard. I couldn't quite believe it when I saw that article pop up in my notifications. This guy apparently decided that while he was out surfing, he wanted to be able to also surf the internet while he's waiting for the next wave. So he put a laptop inside the surfboard and used a Wi-Fi connection at the rescue shack. And now he can surf the internet while he's waiting for the next wave. Some of you have internet-enabled light bulbs. You can control them from an app on your mobile. And many of you, probably all of you, have mobiles with the capability to use Wi-Fi or to use 3G, 4G, or 5G in order to get access to the internet and to exercise the capacity of cloud computing. And finally, Google has a product then in the lower right there, which is a sort of a at-home device, which is a smart speaker, but you can talk to it and ask questions. There's the Google Assistant that responds to you in addition to playing music for you or taking notes if you ask it to, or setting timers or keeping track of your shopping lists. So these are all examples of products that have become part of the internet landscape and will almost certainly continue to proliferate as time goes on. This allows me to make another very important point about the internet and its architecture. It was designed to be extensible. It was designed to be open. All the protocols are developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. Anyone who wishes to is free to join that organization to become part of any of the working groups that they're interested in. The layering of the protocol has allowed many new kinds of protocols to be implemented. And I want to emphasize in particular the internet layer of protocol, the IP layer, has two properties which are extremely important. The first property is that the packets at that layer in the architecture don't know how they're being carried. So they don't know if they're going on Wi-Fi or a radio link or a physical Ethernet channel or something else. This ignorance of the underlying transport is very important to the design because it meant when new transport technologies were developed, for example, optical fiber, we could sweep those into the architecture without changing the internet protocol. The second thing about that internet protocol layer, which is important, is that the packets that move around in that layer don't know what they're carrying. All they have is a payload of bits. And the packet simply knows it's supposed to deliver that payload from source to destination somewhere in the internet. The fact that it doesn't know what the applications are means that when you invent a new application, it's just a matter of interpreting the bits at the edges of the net where the computers are. The network itself doesn't change. And so these packets could be carrying a bit of a web page, could be carrying video, could be carrying audio, could be part of an email, could be anything. The network doesn't have to change in order to carry that data. So this ignorance at the internet protocol layer opens up enormous flexibility. It's also true that if you don't like the existing set of protocols and you think you need a new one in order to support some new application, you have the freedom to invent a new protocol at virtually any layer. The lower down you go, the harder it gets. And the internet protocol layer, of course, is the core of the internet. And when Bob Kahn and I did the original design, we made an estimate for the number of terminations that we might have to support. And we used a 32-bit address space for this. It was called IP version 4. Remember, we went through several iterations. That 32-bit address space allowed for 4.3 billion possible terminations if the addresses were densely allocated. We ran out in 2011. And so prior to that, in the 1990s, recognizing the possibility that we would run out of the 32-bit address space, the Internet Engineering Task Force developed IP version 6, which has a 128-bit address space. And so we're in the process now of moving people from IP version 4 to IP version 6, we have to run both protocols in parallel to take care of the fact that not everyone is upgrading to V6 at the same time. But it is vital that we get to IPv6 everywhere, especially because of this Internet of Things, this rapid proliferation of Internet-enabled devices. The 128-bit address space, if you do the math, is 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, which is a huge address space, which I hope will last until after I'm dead. Then it will be somebody else's problem to worry about the next step. Let's go to the next slide. Now, here I want to give you a glimpse of what's coming and what has already been accomplished to extend the Internet's operation across the solar system in order to support manned and robotic space exploration. If we could have the next slide, please. This effort began in 1998. I became a visiting scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is one of NASA laboratories, starting in 1998, just after the 1997 landing of the Pathfinder on Mars. Now, some of you will remember that the previous successful landings on Mars were in 1976. And then for 20 years, every attempt to get back to Mars failed for one reason or another. But finally, in 1997, the Pathfinder landed. And my colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and I, talking about the Pathfinder success, were thinking, what would happen if there were an internet that spanned the solar system and gave rich connectivity, just like it does here on planet Earth? As opposed to simply a point-to-point radio link, which up until then was the only way that spacecraft could be communicated with, single radio links with, of course, significant potential delay. We thought that we could use the TCP/IP protocols for this purpose. It worked on Earth, surely it would work on Mars. But when we did the math, we realized that the speed of light was too slow. The distances between the planets are literally astronomical. And if you think about a radio transmission between Earth and Mars, when we're closest in our orbits, it still takes 3.5 minutes. And when we're farthest apart in our orbits, it takes 20 minutes for a radio signal to propagate one way, and of course, another 20 minutes to come back. The TCP/IP protocols were simply not designed for that kind of variable and long delay, to say nothing of the other problem, which is that planets are rotating, and we don't know how to stop that. So if there's something on the surface of the planet that you're communicating with a single radio link, and the planet rotates, you can't talk to that device until the planet comes back around again. So we have a variably delayed and disrupted communications environment, and we had to develop a new suite of protocols to take that into account. And we have done so. It's called the Bundle Protocol, and it has now been standardized by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which is a UN organization involving all of the spacefaring nations. So if we could go to the next slide. So what has happened since that 1998 to 1997 landing is a number of spacecraft have been sent to Mars in order to explore that environment. Among them were the Spirit and Opportunity rovers that landed in 2004 in January of that year. And the original design of those two landers and rovers was to transmit data from the surface of Mars directly back to Earth. Now, on Earth, we have 3 70-meter antennas in what's called the Deep Space Network. One is in Canberra, Australia, one's in Goldstone, California, and one is in Madrid, Spain. So these big 70-meter dishes can look out into the solar system, and it was the intent that a radio on board each of Spirit and Opportunity transmit data back to one of those 70-meter dishes. The radios overheated, and of course the engineers immediately said we have to back off on the duty cycle in order to avoid damaging either the radio or the instruments on board. More important, the data rate that was available from the surface of Mars was only 28 kilobits a second. And this, of course, made the scientists very unhappy. And when the engineers said we're going to back off on the duty cycle, that made them even more grumpy. Because that meant less data could come back. But one of the engineers at JPL said, you know, we have an X-band radio on the rover, which isn't powerful enough to go all the way back to Earth, but it could reach an orbiter. And in the years before Spirit and Opportunity landed, we had sent orbiters to map the surface of the planet to figure out where we should send the rovers. And so we reprogrammed the landers, Spirit and Opportunity, and the orbiters to use a prototype of the interplanetary protocols. And so since 2004, virtually all the data that's come back from Mars has gone through that particular store and forward relay, from the surface to the orbiter and back to the Deep Space Network. Every single lander, at least from the US, that has arrived at Mars since that time, since 2004, has used this relay system. So we have shown that store and forward networking is a very valuable asset for space exploration. If we could go to the next slide, please. So now here is our aspiration. We're certainly not going to build this gigantic network and hope that somebody arrives to use it. We're going to build the network step by step, mission by mission. So every mission that is launched now and into the future potentially can have these interplanetary protocols on board. And when those spacecraft have completed their primary missions, they can be converted into relays that become part of a growing interplanetary backbone. And that's exactly what we're hoping to be able to do. At this point, one of the space missions that the US is engaging in is called the Artemis mission, which is for us a return to the moon. And that mission will have on board the interplanetary protocols that have now been tested. They're running now on the International Space Station. We've done a number of tests with Japan and Korea and the European Space Agency. We're all cooperating on the refinement and deployment of these interplanetary protocols. So for me, although I won't be around, at the end of this century to see the full interplanetary backbone running, I'm here at the beginning of this process, very excited, feeling like I'm living in a science fiction story. And so I hope that some of you will actually contribute to the expansion of the interplanetary network as well as the Earth-based one, because we are currently only about 50% penetrated on Earth right now. There are lots of places where internet isn't available, especially in rural parts of most countries. And so there's plenty of work to be done. There's still plenty of opportunity to design and develop new protocols and new applications. So my message to all of you is that there is still great freedom to design and build new applications for the internet, to explore the rest of the solar system, and perhaps someday also implement an interstellar version in order to explore the rest of our galaxy. So I'll stop there. I'm sure there are some questions, and I'm happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, and what a great material and opportunity for us to learn about the history and then the current, and then you already took us to the future of internet. It's amazing. First of all, thank you very much for all the contributions. Because of people like yourself, we are able now to connect to each other, actually. So thank you for that. I will start with the two questions, and then I will open the forum. And the first question is, as I mentioned earlier also, that we, University of Central Asia, we are operating in a very remote areas in the mountains. The internet is available in many places, but still the areas, especially in the mountain communities, they are not getting the full benefit of this amazing product of the world, especially in these times. Are there any plans from Google or anything who are focusing on these communities to providing the connectivity to these areas?
So the answer is yes. There are several things that have already happened, and other things that are we might anticipate. First of all, just to give you an example, Google implemented a backbone network in Kampala, Uganda. And the purpose behind that was to provide an underlying wholesale the citywide network, and then offer at wholesale prices access to that network for retailers to make the internet available and on a competitive basis. That worked so well that we repeated that in Kenya and in Ghana. And then we formed a small joint venture that we expect will replicate this kind of implementation in other parts of Africa, just as an example. We also invested in a system in India where some 400 railroad stations were outfitted with Wi-Fi capability in order to demonstrate that you could use the optical fiber that was running along the railways in order to bring internet to people who were in the neighborhood of the railroad stations. And we saw teachers bringing their students to the railroad stations to do their homework, for example. At Google, as you may know, is part of a larger holding company called Alphabet. And one of our sister companies is called Loon, which is the name coming from the term balloon. But Loon also means loony, crazy. The idea was to design, build, and deploy free floating balloons in the stratosphere, about 60,000 feet, and have them stay within certain latitudes to circle the Earth and provide Wi-Fi capability or 5G or 4G capability from the balloon. The interesting thing is that because they're free-floating balloons, you have to control where they go by using wind. And in order to do that, you move the balloons up and down vertically in order to pick up either a tailwind to move to the next duty station or a headwind in order to loiter over the service area. So the Loon company is now in operation. It is offering commercial service. So that's another contribution that Google has made. In addition to that, of course, we have built a gigantic backbone network, several of them, in fact, to interlink our data centers together all around the world. And another network in order to interconnect the data centers to the public internet. So we have a great deal of peering relationships around the world. Another thing which is not a Google application, but which is relevant to your question, is the effort by Elon Musk's SpaceX company to put up what's called Starlink, which is a constellation of potentially some 20,000 satellites in relatively low Earth orbit, somewhere in the 700 to 1,100 kilometer range. Those satellites, should they all get up there, will, in theory, provide access to internet from literally every square inch of the surface of the Earth, including the oceans as well as land. It remains to be seen whether this all works out, but Mr. Musk has launched some 200 of those satellites already. We also are waiting to see what the finances look like, and will it be affordable and sustainable. But if he is successful, that will be yet another alternative way of getting access, especially from rural parts of the country, which, as you point out, are poorly served in many parts of the world today. So that's sort of where we are in terms of deployment.
Thank you very much, Vint. We have with us Aman Tentiv. He is a managing partner at Tech Firm and on one of the technology leaders in Kyrgyzstan. He would like to ask a question also. Aman?
Okay.
Aman, you can just unmute and then you can ask.
Yes. Hello, sir. First of all, let me thank you for everything what you have done and everything what you're doing.
You're very welcome.
It's amazing. You have changed the world, and now we're living in absolutely different world. And the new generation, I think they're more like it, so they have a different type of life. And this work what you have done, it changed lives not only in the people of the city, but people who is living in the rural areas and with the country with the poverty. So now you're doing the more and they're going them between the Earth and other stars. My question is about AI, and what do you think that AI will take over in the future, this development, and will manage this process? It's first question. And second question, what do you think, if any, dangers with the AI in the future, because it's developing and going on such very high level of the development, and AI will be able to independently work and affect the life of the people.
So let me start with the AI question. First of all, the term artificial intelligence it means many things to different people. The thing which you see today that is most prominent is what we would call at Google machine learning, which is a kind of a certain narrow kind of artificial intelligence. Artificial general intelligence, which is more human-like, which is capable of planning, of extrapolation, of abstraction, and the like, is still not within our grasp. Even though that problem has been studied and explored for literally on the order of 60 years now. But looking at machine learning for just a moment, it's a very powerful technology. It is being used, for example, to do automatic translation. It's being used to do speech recognition. It's being used to do image analysis. For example, looking at possible cancer or other diseases. The image processing of machine learning systems allows us to detect certain kinds of diseases. But these techniques are brittle in the sense that they don't always work the way we expect them to. And the problem that we have is that we can't always predict the way in which some of these machine learning methods will break. And so there's still a lot of research to be done in order to make the machine learning systems more robust than they are today. In spite of the fact that they are somewhat brittle, they are still showing very, very useful results. And so there's a lot of investment at Google and elsewhere in these kinds of mechanisms. One of the big issues associated with machine learning and neural networks is that the design of the neural network is still very much an art. And you literally do this manually. And there's a lot of speculation about whether you could automate the process of exploring the design space for a multi-layer neural network in order to optimize the particular interfaces between the layers. I'm sure many of the participants in this call know that the big leap forward for machine learning came when we were able to build multi-layer neural networks that were literally hundreds of layers deep. Before that, in the 1960s, there were experiments done with devices that were called perceptrons at the time. They were sort of 1 or 2 layers deep, and they did not have very much capability to learn to interpret their inputs and produce useful outputs. So it was the multi-layer neural networks that really made the leap forward. Now, let me make sure I've understood your second question, because I'm not sure that I got the main point. So let's try that one more time, please.
Can you repeat your second question, Aman?
Yes, please.
Thank you for your answer on AI. I mean, my first question was how you see the future in terms of effect of the future in the internet. I mean, how it will, what's the next step of
what's coming next? Okay. So yeah. I can give you some trends. I will say that my ability to make predictions is terrible. I remember I'm one of the guys that picked the 32-bit address space. We now need 128. First of all, there is no question that there is a continued trend towards higher capacity in the system. I mean, the fact that we are doing this right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic shows that the internet has grown in capacity in 2 ways. We had been using the internet for streaming video outbound from content distribution sites for some time now. But these kinds of conferences require 2-way high-speed communication, and the internet has succeeded in supporting that. And so that's pretty exciting. So the idea that we can get higher bandwidths with optical fiber networks, for example, and higher speed radio, as you know, 5G is coming and 6G is speculated upon. And then there's the Elon Musk style Starlink capabilities as well. So higher speed is clearly a part of the future. The second thing, which I think is also evident, is that the application space is getting richer and richer over time. And again, I want to refer back to both the layered architecture and the freedom that it gives to invent new protocols, but also the cloud-based platforms are giving us the ability to do computation in ways that we could not do before. In the academic world, you hear the term computational X for some value of X all the time, whether it's computational biology, computational linguistics, computational cosmology, and so on. What's happening is computing has become absolutely central to our research world, our business world, our social world, and every single day we make increasing use of computing power in order to carry out our daily work. And I think that is a trend that will continue as well. In the end, by the end of this decade, I think that we won't even think about networking at all. It will just be there everywhere. It will be like the atmosphere. It's a little bit like electricity, which people expect to come out of the wall from a plug, and they don't expect it to go away unless you happen to be in a place where electricity is still not reliably available. And then you're much more conscious of the fact that it might not work. The internet, I hope, will get to the point where we'll just assume it will work all the time as we need it.
Thank you, Vint. As we have some government officials are also listening to this, and I received a couple of questions. What would be your advice for the internet security from the Kyrgyz government with regards to resilience, security resilience?
It's a very good question. And of course, it has high dimensionality. There are many things that we should do. Let me start with what you and I should do as users of the system. We need to be provided with better tools for protecting ourselves. Up until now, the typical way of creating access control to the accounts that you and I use is usernames and passwords. But we know that those are weak mechanisms for protection. For one thing, as humans, we don't pick very good passwords because we have trouble remembering them. And so incredibly, there are some people who use the word password to be their password because it's easy to remember. Unfortunately, lots of other people know that, and so accounts get broken into. To say nothing of the fact that we have increasing amounts of computing power available to each of us, whether it's on our laptops or on the cloud or in our mobiles. And that computing power can be used to break cryptography. It can be used to break passwords. So two-factor authentication turns out to be a really powerful tool. It's instead of just a password, you have another device which generates a cryptographic a password which changes every time you use it. That's a very powerful tool to inhibit someone breaking into your account. So two-factor authentication is an important tool. We should all be asking for that. There is a small problem if the two-factor authentication involves multiple physical devices. You can imagine having to carry a bag of these little devices around, to deal with the hundreds of accounts that people often have on the internet. I include myself in that. I'm right now using 3 or 4 different two-factor authentication systems, and I have to carry a little bag of these devices around with me. It's clear there's some engineering that needs to be done so that a single device can handle multiple cryptographic passwords. So that's one thing. Second thing is to make heavy use of cryptography in several different ways. One of them is to encrypt traffic as it's flowing through the network, so that if somebody breaks into the communication, all they will see is encrypted traffic. And we do this as a matter of course at Google. All of our traffic is encrypted while it's in flight. Second thing you can do is to encrypt data when it's at rest. So all of our devices that we use at Google are encrypted on the disks. In our cloud system, all the data is encrypted when it's stored in the cloud. But we just announced literally a few days ago a new capability in the Google Cloud, if you permit me to make a little advertisement. It's called confidential computing. And what this means is that if somebody is going to run a program and use data in our cloud, we now have the ability to let them deliver the data and the program in encrypted form, and it stays encrypted until it is actually inside the computer that's going to run the application. And then the computer itself has keys in it to decrypt the program and the data in order to do the computation. The keys are in the control of the users. So Google doesn't know what the keys are. They arrive in encrypted form, they end up on a processor, and they get decrypted inside the processor with the user's keys. So this is yet another way of protecting information that is being moved around in the net. So cryptography is your friend in this case. A third thing, which I think is vital and should be taken on board, especially by the academics in this audience, and that is the weakness of software, the ability to penetrate operating systems, to penetrate applications, is a consequence of mistakes that we make when we write software. It's truly embarrassing to accept the point that while we have been programming computers for on the order of 80 years now, nobody seems to know how to write a piece of software that does not have any bugs. And those bugs become vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And so to the academics, especially in this audience, I would argue we need to build software production environments that can detect mistakes before we let the software get out into use. That's a non-trivial problem. It's very difficult. The software environment has to recognize the sort of the signature of the errors that we make. Some of the errors are really simple. For example, referring to a variable that hasn't been set yet and then branching on a conditional, or perhaps getting a loop off by one, or maybe doing an input of data into a buffer which is too small for the data that's read in, and so there's an overrun, and then the data that shows up where it doesn't belong could be executable code, in which case you branch into that part of the code and possibly take over the machine. There are all kinds of scenarios like this. So we have to learn how to write software which is less buggy, and we need help to achieve that objective. I'm pretty sure that people in the audience could add to that list of things that we could do to make systems more robust and protected. There are commercial things that companies have tried to use to help deal with some of these problems. It's called cyber insurance. And all that really does is say, if you make a mistake and there is a penetration of your system and the customers sue you for that, there may be, the cyber insurance will cover the financial cost of that liability. It doesn't fix the bugs, however. That's a much more fundamental problem. And so for anyone in this audience that's interested in making the internet and the software it uses safer and more secure, you have a big opportunity to improve our software environments so that we can reduce the level of penetration that currently takes place.
Thank you very much, Vint, for comprehensive answers. And do you have a few more minutes to take a couple of more questions?
Yes, I do. I have about 5 more minutes before I have the next conference call.
Okay, and so we have a question. What are your thoughts on SpaceX starting internet service? Do you think it is possible to have accessible internet at any point of the world for free?
Well, for free. I don't know about free, and I'm sure Mr. Musk is probably not thinking free. He might be thinking subsidized. That might be a different thing, a business model in which some of the cost is offset in some way. At Google, for example, much of the cost of the services that we offer are offset by advertising revenues. And so we're able to offer to billions of people applications that otherwise would cost them some amount of money. Of course, that means that advertisements are a part of the environment of the products that you're using. The alternative, of course, is to ask people to pay for the services that they use, and that's what I think Mr. Musk has in mind. So I don't think free is necessarily in the offing, unless, as I say, there's a way of offsetting cost. I mean, all the costs have to be paid, otherwise it's not a sustainable business. In terms of reach, however, it's pretty evident that the design that is part of the Starlink service does involve a sufficiently large constellation of satellites that literally every square inch of the Earth would be covered if he is successful in deploying this. This is a non-trivial exercise. Routing across this constellation of satellites is a pretty difficult calculation. Are intended, I think, to be inter-satellite links so that you could send data up to the constellation of satellites, have it hop among the satellites, and then go back down to the ground. So it's a very ambitious program. Nonetheless, it looks technically feasible. Whether it's financially viable, of course, remains to be seen.
Thank you. And we have Talan Sultanov. He is the lead expert at the World Bank and also the president of Internet Society for Kyrgyz Republic. He is conveying his gratitude for the Internet Society for providing internet projects among all the communities. So he was the previous advisor to the Prime Minister of Kyrgyz Republic as well.
I'm very pleased to hear that. As you know, a long connection with the Internet Society.
My last question is about Internet Ecosystem Innovation Committee, which has been found last year. And Kyrgyz Republic as a country, there's a lot of focus on the digital economy. So how do you see that this committee will help the countries like Kyrgyz Republic to go on the digital economy?
So let me approach this from the standpoint of our current situation, which is this COVID-19 pandemic. It's very clear that at least for some kinds of work, it's possible to support remote work from home, for example, which is where I am right now in my basement. And now, not everyone has work which can be done that way. But a lot of us can. And so that's an important contribution, let's say, to government policy and to private sector policy, which is to permit people to work from home if they can, in order to protect themselves from the current COVID-19 pandemic. I think that after this pandemic is over, that we will probably end up allowing people to work from home more frequently. Because it's the technical feasibility. I think more generally speaking, governments can adopt policies that would encourage investment in internet provision in order to spread the access of internet so that we have less inequality with regard to access to network and also access to high bandwidth broadband internet, which enables so many applications. So policies that encourage investment and even policies that might offer subsidies for people who are in lower income levels, but who could very clearly use internet for their own benefit, taking classes, for example, improving their capabilities to do work, are all things that come along with broadband access to the internet. So I think policies that encourage that capacity, the development of that capacity is very important. And I'm hoping that the governments of the world, as they meet, for example, at the Internet Governance Forum each year, will see those opportunities to improve access for everyone and thereby improve the potential that the internet brings to their own economies.
Thank you very much, Vint. And maybe in one sentence, if you would answer, Professor Neil Gallagher is asking, does the use of IPv6 eliminate the need for private IP addresses?
We absolutely have to get to IPv6 simply because of the proliferation of devices that will demand access and use of the internet. And so all I can say is the governments of the world should be saying to everyone, please get IPv6 implemented so we can continue to reap the benefits of this broad and widespread network and all the devices that are attached to it.
Thank you very much, Vint Cerf. Thank you for your time and all the knowledge you have shared with us. I think it's very, very valuable. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you everyone for your participation.